company currently owes about $300 billion.
Take direct responsibility for delivering unfinished homes and supporting demand for housing.
China's real estate bubble is finally popping. This was a long time coming. Back in 2009, 60 Minutes had a segment highlighting this very issue.
The largest housing bubble in human history.
The excessive debt.
It has since accumulated over $300 billion in debt.
Ghost cities.
And what they call a ghost city of new towers with no residents.
And affordability issues.
People in China live on less than $2 a day. They simply can't afford these.
On this channel, we talk all things real estate, and the topic of China is important because it may impact the way you buy houses in America. Today, we're going to discuss exactly what's going on in China as it relates to their housing issue, their extreme debt, and its effect on real estate in the United States. First off, what's going on in China? Well, we kind of have to go back just 15 years ago. Around 15 years ago, most people in China actually lived in rural areas, but with the increase in production and industries and higher pay, migration to the city dramatically increased. With the increase of population in the city, you have to provide a place where people can live. And with the influx of people, real estate developers saw this as an opportunity to make housing and make a lot of money. And one of the biggest real estate developers that we're going to highlight in today's video is called Evergrande. So like most developers, Evergrande saw this opportunity, this prime time to take advantage of building tons and tons of apartments to house the influx of people coming from the countryside over to the city. And in order for them to keep demand of all the people coming into the city, they had to borrow a ton of money. And yes, this is totally normal for most real estate developers to borrow a ton of money to have a good amount of debt in order for them to keep up with the demand of housing. But where Evergrande went wrong is that they borrowed a little bit too much, and then on top of that, they didn't complete their projects. That's why you have so many of these so-called ghost towns in China. So just to simplify, a company like Evergrande would borrow money in order to buy land from the government, and then they will borrow more money for construction to construct these apartment buildings, and then they will take deposits from their customers in order to start a new project before finishing other projects. And then to keep up with more demand and to pay for all the construction and material costs, they will borrow more money from investors inland and investors outland in various international markets. And so they would issue bonds to people in order to borrow money from investors so they can pay them an interest rate. And so you see Evergrande and other real estate developers during this time had a lot of people to pay back. They had local banks to pay back. They had to provide housing back to people who left deposits. They had to give money and interest payments to bondholders. On top of that, Evergrande offered products where regular citizens can invest in their company in order to receive either like a quarterly dividend or some sort of payments from the apartments that they are selling, which is essentially a wealth front product. And so Evergrande grew super fast within the past 10 years. They went from a company that was essentially worth nothing to holding over $300 billion worth of assets. But at the same time, they built up over $300 billion worth of debt in their name. And so you have this company that has hundreds of projects that are unfinished, and they have billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in debt. And in China, real estate is a big part of GDP. Real estate in China accounts for close to 1/3 of GDP in China. Compare that to a country like United States, where we usually fall between 15 and 18% of GDP for our real estate services. And so you have a company like Evergrande that has hundreds of billions of dollars in debt, and if they fall, that will have a big impact on domestic GDP. And so companies like Evergrande start to feel the pressures of all this debt that they had to pay back. And during this time, the government, to discourage leveraging, they issued a new policy called the 3 red line policy. And the 3 red line policy just followed 3 main rules. So number 1, the liability to asset ratio had to be less than 70%. So essentially, if you own an asset that's worth, let's say, $100,000, the maximum amount of debt that you can have on that asset is $70,000. The second policy was called the net gearing ratio. The net gearing ratio cannot exceed over 100%. And essentially, that was equity divided by the amount of debt a property or a particular company holds. The third red line policy stated that the cash to short-term debt ratio had to be more than 1x. So essentially, they had to have enough cash in order to cover all their debts. And so most developers like Evergrande did not follow all of these red lines. And so the government put a hold from them borrowing tons of money from banks. And on top of that, the government discouraged banks from issuing out more mortgages to their citizens. And so developers were hit with this double whammy. So number 1, they couldn't borrow as much money from banks in order to finish their project. And then on top of that, citizens were not getting as much loans as they were getting before. And so that sort of put the demand for these apartments lower. And so you don't have as many deposits fueling your machine in order for you to finish your projects and start new projects. And then on top of that, I was reading that the population in urban cities have declined recently within the past 2 years. And so some people are actually moving back to the countryside. They're sick of the city. They're sick of these ghost cities. They're sick of these fake promises from these billion-dollar companies. And they're all like, hey, I'm going back to the country. And so you have now lower demand in these new construction apartments. And I think the people, the citizens, the people actually giving their money for deposits to these apartments are hurt the most, right? You have these big time CEOs, they have their yachts, they have their mansion. Yes, their company can go bankrupt, but they can still be good and leave a company with billions of dollars to their name. So of course, the people that are hurt most are the people actually looking to buy these apartments, and they put their life savings into a down payment for these apartments, and these apartments are just vacant and they're never going to get finished. And I was reading online that in China, it takes 50 years of medium household income in order for them to buy a house. And compare that to America, especially looking at a more expensive state like New York, that ratio is about 10. So it takes about 10 times the annual household income in order for most New Yorkers to buy a house. And so you have generations and generations of families saving up their money so they can finally own property and to put their money to work. And as we know, real estate holds a big part of real GDP. And in China, they are not as diversified in their investments as we are here in America. And so most of people's wealth in China is tied up into real estate, either in them buying a home or doing some sort of construction, and also investing in these companies like Evergrande in order for them to get interest payments from either the projects that they finish or the rent that they collected. They receive a small portion of that. But recently, Evergrande defaulted on their payments to their Wealthfront customers, and this sparked outrage in China. And also, they missed their interest payments to their offshore bondholders like a BlackRock or a Goldman Sachs and more. So that's essentially the housing crisis in China. So what's going to happen? A lot of people think the government is going to step in, take control of companies like Evergrande, clean up their balance sheet, either destroy some of these ghost cities, and just have stricter rules and laws about leveraging and loans, or just print a ton of money. I believe also the Chinese government will also look at other sectors in their economy that they can boost a little bit more so they won't be so heavily reliant on real estate for their GDP. The other thing to consider is China's impact on the world. As we stated before, China is the biggest country, the biggest contributor to global GDP. And it makes sense. Everything is made in China and we export and import a ton from them. So if China has an impact on their housing crisis, which affects their real GDP, in turn, that will affect global GDP. But what's the real world effects here in the United States? So here in America, we have a housing shortage, right? Our supply of houses are way much lower than the demand for houses. And so with that, a lot of banks and the government allowed a lot of developers to borrow a ton of money. And so you have a lot of developers just developing a ton of single family properties, apartment buildings, new construction. And with the increase in supplies, these prices are super high and a lot of people just cannot afford these type of prices. And so even now in the news recently, you have a lot of builders either saying that they're going to stop constructing new construction homes, or they're going to significantly discount current new construction homes on the market because they don't want to be holding the bag at the end of the day. So in America, we have this shortage of housing, but at the same time, builders have stopped constructing new construction homes because everything's expensive and their clients can't buy their house because interest rates are higher and just price of the home is just high too. And so are we going to go through something similar to what's happening in China, where we have our American-based developers not being able to pay back their loans because they can't sell these properties to clients because clients can't afford them and interest rates are higher? And with these higher prices, because builders had to pay more to actually construct these houses, and then before when we printed a ton of money and we lowered the interest rate, that really ticked up demand for housing and a lot of home values went up. And in the same way, China is heavily reliant on their real estate market that makes up to a third of their real GDP. Our home values are increasing and taking up greater share of domestic GDP. And the bigger one sector holds of real GDP, the more we are prone to risk. If this one industry falls, we all fall. So that's why it's so important to diversify our investing strategies, and that the government kind of heightens the interest rate, and that's what they're doing, so we can kind of cool down the housing market so we won't be as reliant on that for our GDP. And so if that takes a turn, at least we have stocks, or at least we have bonds, or at least we have services or products or cryptocurrencies or other things. Let me know down below what you all think of China's issue and its impact here in America. What do you think is going to happen and its effect all around the world? Will this change the way you buy a house today? Or let's say you're investing in a rental property or starting a flip on a property, knowing about the interest rates and higher prices, are you going to change your strategy? What are you going to do in order to pivot? All right, thank you all. Be sure to like, comment down below and subscribe, and I'll talk to you all later.